Thank you for joining us tonight for the lecture about illustrating Marble Hill. We have been very lucky to be working with Historic England for a number of different archaeological digs. And what has been really magic about that is that they bring not just those archaeologists, but a number of different professions into those digs to be able to share and understand a little bit more about the history. Marble Hill is being revived, and it will see the house open for 5 days a week for free. And we will also see our wonderful cafe open in the spring, which is just a month away. So that's really terribly exciting. We'll see sports facilities that are rejuvenated and better for our community. And also our landscape is being invested in. And we've been part of this project to understand a little bit more about the history of our landscape. And it has been really lovely to work with the team at Historic England to find out from the ground much more about Marble Hill. It is with great delight that tonight we have the wonderful Judith Dobie, who's going to be speaking about her role as an illustrator and this just tells you a little bit more about where we've been doing those archaeological digs. So in the 18th century, ideas about garden design were changing very fast. And up until the 1710, former gardens had dominated for decades. But from 1730, a new pastoral style today, known as English landscape garden, became really popular. Looking at an engraving from about 1749, this shows the terraces and slopes towards the river and groves of trees that you can see in Marble Hill. In 1991, a plan was placed in the Norfolk Records Office, and this showed the gardens in 1749, or what we think might be. This plan featured an ice house seat, a flower garden, a 9-pin alley, and a grotto. And it's been through exploration that we've been trying to understand a little bit more about these sites via a number of archaeological digs. And the first area that we have spoken about as part of this lecture series was the ice house seat. If you'd like to hear any more about those particular sites, do join us on YouTube for Thomas Cromwell's lectures. But also we've got another one in February to talk about some of the landscape. But the second area was the 9-pin bowling alley, which we're hoping to recreate and offer our community 9-pin bowling pins and information about how you can play the game for free, so that we can explore our history through gaming as well. And the last area that I talked about will be our lecture in February, and that's around the landscape. And in the summer, we'll have the grotto, which at that point, we'll be really excited to hopefully have Judith back to come and finish off some of the illustrations that she's started. So more about Judith. She's an archaeological illustrator for Historic England and has been part of the Marble Hill story for a while. She illustrated one of our guidebooks. So it is, and also she's a very local illustrator, just down the road in Barnes. So it has been really lovely, as she confesses, to be able to cycle to work, which isn't always the case. So without further ado, it's lovely to have you this evening, Judith, and please tell us a little bit more about how you've been illustrating Marble Hill.
Hello, well, I'm Judith Dobie and I'm an illustrator with Historic England, and I work mostly in archaeology, and that could be all sorts of illustrations, mostly for publication. So sometimes I draw the finds from excavation, but one of the things I do is to do reconstructions of the sites once the evidence has been investigated. And so I like very much to go out on the site because it's really helpful to understand the landscape. And so I was at Marble Hill. Next picture, please. this is the sort of illustration I do. And I mean, it's not great art. It's meant as a sort of, you know, reminder to me of what the landscape is like. And because it's very difficult to get back to that. I find working on the site and drawing there, you get an understanding of the landscape. So this actually is a picture of a site down in Wiltshire, and that's the sort of drawing I do. And where you've got, you can see where the trench edge is, where the sort of fencing is. And so beyond that, beyond the buildings there is the river, and that's the site of a Roman villa. And so that's what I sort of aim to do. Next picture, please. Next picture. So this is one that I did at Marble Hill. And what I was aiming for there was the slope down to the river, because I know that when I come to do, what I aim to do is I'm going to do, I want to capture the landscape and the slopes and the landscape especially, because that's what I find difficult, you know, when I'm not here. And so that's what I'm aiming for. And that's to put in the trenches and their position in the landscape. So next picture. And this is the grotto, and that was the entrance to the grotto. So there again, I've written in sort of trench 3 and trench 4, so that when Tom's finished his excavations, I'll be able to, and has decided what illustrations he would like. That's the way it works, really, that it will be the archaeologist that decides what illustrations he'll want for his publication, and then we'll discuss it with me, and then we'll do a series of roughs until everybody is satisfied with, you know, what I produce, and then we'll do the finished picture. So this is a sort of really early state. And the thing about Marble Hill is it's still more, you were hearing about this, more excavation to do, especially at the grotto. And I imagine that I will have to do some pictures of the grotto. And I hope I'm going to do some of the inside, because they've got bits of coral and shells and things from the interior. So that will be very interesting to do. But it takes a bit of time. So these are the preliminary drawings. So next picture. So I thought I would show you what I did at West Amesbury Farm, because in that case, I've got the drawings that I did on the site and then my finished drawings. And West Amesbury Farm is near to Stonehenge, and we call it the A303 project. And it was a Historic England in 2016, the winter of 2016 to 17, did a big survey and excavation in this area. It's an area of Stonehenge which hasn't been examined as much as some areas have. And it's mostly, most of it was a geophysics survey. Geophysics is like taking an X-ray of the ground. So you come up with a plan from what you see underneath. And so these are small excavations that they did, looking at, to try and you know, explain the survey that they had. So I went out and drew in Salisbury Plain in the winter. Very cold it was too. So this is what I wanted there to do, was to mark in the trenches. And this is trench 5. So this is my view looking up, and with the fencing round and the position of trench 5. And then next picture. And this is the view looking down. And I knew this when they did the geophysics survey. One thing they found was that, I mean, this all sounds very undramatic, really, when you think about Stonehenge, which is so dramatic, and some of the great sites around it. But I think it's really interesting because it's like a sort of snapshot into the past of things which are not hugely dramatic, but let's just think this is how people were living and their sort of concerns. So this is trench 5, and they put this trench in because they could see a ditch on the geophysics survey, and it had a little kink at this point where another small ditch joined it. And so they put the trench in to see if they could understand why it kinked. And when they did the excavation of Trench 5, they found there was 2 burials, and they'd been buried one, and then very shortly afterwards another, and they'd been both buried in the ditch very shortly after the ditch was dug, and slightly into the fill of the ditch and into the bottom of it. And you can see that they have a view of Stonehenge from there. It's the nearest point. This kink in the ditch was the nearest point to Stonehenge. So you have a view of Stonehenge from the edge of the ditch, not from the interior. You can't see it from the interior, but from the edge of the ditch, you can see over to see Stonehenge, and you can see like the heel stone and the various barrows. And that's what I've drawn in my very sketchy sketch. And the two men that were buried there, they think that they were wrapped in something. And so this is obviously I would know that this was a view that I would have to do for the finished report, because it's obviously, you link it with the view of Stonehenge, which must have been significant for these two men. They think it's Middle Bronze Age, so contemporary with Stonehenge. So next picture. And so this is the picture I produced. So you can see Stonehenge in the distance and the heel stone and the various barrows, and they're burying one of the men. I think I would have found this very difficult to do if I hadn't actually gone on the site, because the ground is so undulating, and it helped a lot, actually having my sketches. Next picture. So one of the other things which was investigated from the geophysics survey there were a lot of pits, lots and lots and lots of pits that showed up on the survey. And some of these pits turned out to be, the remnants of blown over trees when you get a great hole when the roots come up. But a lot of them were actually dug pits. Historic England's archaeology is centred down in Portsmouth at Fort Cumberland there, and that's where the laboratories and everything are. And when this excavation was going ahead, we had filtered news came down from the excavation. They'd found some rubbish pits, and there were a lot of disturbance by badgers. And we'd had disturbance by badgers before from the previous excavation, so thought, oh, this doesn't sound too great, But however, it's very interesting. And this was the excavation of 5 pits. And that's my drawing. And it was really awful conditions. It was terribly cold. And if you're drawing, I draw in pen and ink usually. And if it's raining, that's hard. And then, of course, so you stand still to draw, and you get colder and colder. So it's a very meager drawing, really, but it was still quite useful to me, because it puts the pits and the landscape and the horizon, which is what I want and what I need to remember when I'm doing the finished picture. The pits were full of it wasn't rubbish, they were full of objects, and they were the sort of things they were they had a lot of flint debris. It was people doing crafts, there was cooking things, lot of pottery, really lot of pottery. And they were mid-Neolithic, so earlier than the ditch that we looked at before. There were some beads in them. They weren't all the same sort of things. They were slightly different. One of them had a post in it. And if you think about it, all the ground there is chalky. So anything that you dig, like the ditch that we looked at before, apparently you could still see it in the Iron Age. So anything that was disturbed the ground, you get this white mark, which is sort of, of significance. So these pits some of the pits were filled in almost immediately, and some were left open for weeks, and then some were left open for a long time. And what they discovered from the contents of the pits, and that in fact the people that were coming to this area, they were coming in like the late autumn or the winter, and they were spending that time here and regularly coming back. And they were pastoralists. They came with their animals, they came with pigs, and they came with cattle, and they maybe spent the winter in this place in the Avon Valley that would be a little more sheltered. And and then they would move off again. And there was a burial. There was a burial that had been, in fact, disturbed by the badger digging. And but the burial, they could tell from the man's enamel of his teeth that he most likely had come from Ireland. He'd been born and brought up in Ireland. And then before he came over to live in this area of the country in Wiltshire. And so you get the idea of this small group of people traveling around and maybe calling in at various places through a year, seasonally, driving their animals, and maybe having connections with people from quite far distance away. The man was aged sort of about 30 to 50 years old. And this is sort of middle Neolithic. So he might have seen people, he might have seen burials and funerals at Stonehenge, or what became Stonehenge. And he might have seen the first megaliths being erected. So I just think it's like a wonderful snapshot of something which looks, you know, they found some rubbish pits and it doesn't seem, you know, it seems a bit dreary really, but actually, and the contents are wonderful pottery, wonderful decorated pottery from the pits. So, and you get this glimpse of these people who were sort of on the move and then returning to the same place. And I also think, like, you know, there was if you wanted to mark that you had been there or you had existed at all, really, this is the way you did it, because you couldn't write a book, or, you know, nobody's going to read it or remember your name, but there would maybe be these seasonal events that you came to, and then people would talk about it, and you would talk about when your grandfather did this or when they built, you know, something, and it would be a sort of memory in that way. So in that way you would be remembered. So next picture. And that's the finished picture that I did. And I wanted to have them like the idea like of moving off, and that it would be an exciting moment because you would be ready to go. And I had more dogs in the original picture, but I had to come back on the dogs, because if you have a lot of dogs in a picture, it's like you found some dog skeletons, which we hadn't. But these people were pastoralists, so they would likely have had some dogs to help with the herding. But we had pig bones and we had cattle bones, so that was all right. So that's the sort of idea I wanted to get of them moving off and leaving behind these, some of them quite open pits, with the significance that we only guess that, really. So next picture. And the archaeologist, who was David Roberts, he wanted me to do a picture of the badgers. And the badgers, again, you say, oh no, not badger disturbance, but this was a Neolithic badger set, which makes it seem quite different. And they had dug into the pits a bit, and then obviously the man that was buried there, his grave had been disturbed. When I first was doing the drawings for David Roberts, he said he would like me to, they thought they had they didn't see it as a burial of a burial of the whole person because of the disturbance. So they thought it was a burial of a head. And so he said, now just think about, you know, how would you have a burial of a head? What would be the story behind that? So we thought, well, maybe it would be a trophy head, that it might have been your enemy that you were burying the head. So I was to do a drawing to show that. So I did them exultant, holding the head up by the hair. And then they said, well, maybe it might have been somebody that when you're on your travels, somebody had died and you couldn't bring the whole burial back. So you just bring the head back to be buried in West Amesbury. And so we did one of that with them looking sorrowful. And then he had another look at all of the archaeology and the records with the human bones expert. And they decided actually it was a crouch burial, and that the badgers had dispersed the bones. So they got, in fact, so I had to do another drawing of the crouch burial. But I mean, it's in a way, it's interesting. It was interesting for him because he can use it in his lectures, because this is our thinking and this is the way we thought around it. And so the drawings are not wasted. In fact, they're interesting and important in how you analyze the evidence and how you come to your conclusions. And so so anyway, this is the picture of the badgers, and I did them in collage because he wanted it to look a bit different. from the paintings to sort of mark that he was now talking about something different. So it shows the badgers digging into the pits, and with all the different bits of prehistoric pottery getting shoved out. So next picture. And so this is one that I showed before to show what my drawings are like on the site. And this is Brixton Deverill, which is a village near to, well, it's not very far from Salisbury. And it's Bridgewater House is the house that you can see there. And it was the one where the landowner dug a trench to lay his cable, to an electric cable to light his outhouse, and he found a Roman mosaic. And so this is the drawing I did, because they did a geophysics survey of the whole of his paddock, and it showed the plan of a Roman villa, a big Roman villa with at least one courtyard and possibly two. Part of it lies under the house, and beyond the house is a river. So it's down in a valley, and it's quite steeply sloping. So next picture. And so that's looking the other way, looking up to show the horizon that way. And so I went and drew on the site when, having got the survey, they needed to go in and do a little bit of archaeology to try and date it, because the idea was that the site would be scheduled, and so it would be prevented from any, deep ploughing, anything like that, or building on top of it. So that was my drawing looking the other way. And then this is the picture I did as the reconstructions, the next one. And so this is based really mostly on the geophysics survey, which is like a plan, but different from prehistory, where you know not very much really. The further back you go, the less you know. But once you get to the Romans, of course, you've got writings, and there are lots of comparative villas to look at, lots of plans of comparative villas. So it's based on comparison with other villas in Britain and the geophysics plan. But even so, I mean, I've got a bathhouse in there, and the archaeologist, again, as David Roberts said, well, I think we'll have one without the bathhouse, because he wasn't sure that the bathhouse was there. So I did an alternative, which I think is quite a good way, because you can't be sure of a lot of things. So you could say, well, it might have been like this, or it might have been like that. So that's the end. It's just a sort of idea of some of the work I do, but I do lots of fines drawing and other sorts of archaeological drawing too. This is just an element of it.
Thank you so much, Judith. Fascinating to understand the process, and this opens up the floor for any questions, but also a little bit of a plug for Thomas Cromwell's Zoom lecture on the 15th, where he's going to be talking about the landscape, and we look forward to being able to talk a little bit more about the grotto when we explore that in the summer. So please do type anything in the chat if you would like to ask Judith. I've got a few questions already being posed. The first one is, how did you get into being an archaeological illustrator?
Well, it was sort of by accident. A friend and I were looking for a holiday job. I went to art school and did graphics there. And we were looking for a holiday job one summer, and were turned down by all the waitressing jobs, and ended up, the only people that accepted us was an excavation at Winchester. And so it was a very lucky break, because it's the most wonderful excavation of the old minster at Winchester. And I really loved it. I was a very good digger. People that do art are very often very good excavators, because I think it's because they've got a very keen eye for color and texture. And so they're good. I could never interpret anything. Didn't know what anything ever meant, but I could see the different layers very sharply. And I think there's lots of very good, famous archaeologists, and they have a surprising background in art. And I think you can understand why, really.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have you had any opportunities to draw any interesting artifacts in your career?
Well, lots. I worked one site I worked on almost the whole time that I've done any archaeological drawing at all was at Mucking, which is a site. It's a Saxon site on the Thames estuary near Tilbury, and it's a sort of like slightly little raised up area. So if you were coming across the North Sea and you were stopping, you'd stop there and have a settlement. So it's been like from prehistoric Roman, Saxon times, and they're wonderful finds from there. Um, and and we were able to reconstruct. It's very acidic, the soil, so sort of hardly anything survives that's organic. There's hardly any bones, but there's a sort of shadow of the shape of the person in the graves. There are two cemeteries that I worked on especially, and you could really get a picture of the people and how they lay, and we were able to reconstruct some of their clothes, which there's not all that much, Anglo-Saxon costume survives or anything. So a lot of it was quite new, that sort of thing. And you got a sort of real feeling for the people in a way.
Excellent. Gosh, yeah, I mean, that must have been fascinating to sort of try and reconstruct that clothing from from very little, presumably.
Yeah, so it would get mineralized on the backs of brooches. So you'd have a little patch of woven cloth, and so you were working with a textile expert, and it was surprising how much you could build up, what a picture you could build up.
Absolutely. So do you see yourself as an artist or a historian?
Oh, not a historian, an illustrator. I mean,
And
of course, you gather information, but I remember one of the first jobs I did when I worked for, it was Ancient Monuments in those days. I had to draw some barrows, and I didn't know what a barrow was. And barrow is a sort of burial mound, sort of Bronze Age these were. But I didn't know, I'd never heard of such a thing. So I think you gradually accumulate knowledge by working on the site.
absolutely. And for budding young archaeology illustrators, how do you go about getting experience in this field?
Well, I don't know quite. I mean, it's a whole different setup these days because, of course, there's a lot of commercial archaeology. I mean, that's one way in. They all have drawing offices and people drawing finds and um, plans and things like that and reconstructions. Um, I think you get a bit lucky, really. We sometimes we've had various people come for maybe a year as a sort of intern in the office, and we used to have a lot more of that. We'd have people, maybe if they got a job at a unit, they would come and work with us for a fortnight or so. So that I think you strike lucky, really.
Yes, absolutely. Do you have a favourite era that you illustrate?
Well,
Um,
I like drawing prehistoric best because you know least. So you've got more scope, I think. So it's sort of quite fun to do when you don't know so much.
does that more creative sort of
Yeah,
go
yeah.
for?
I mean, it's a funny sort of thing to do. It's sort of because it's sort of half between a technical illustration and an imaginative illustration. And the thing is, if it's well, sometimes that a technical illustration is fine. That's absolutely what you like. I mean, there's not a right way of doing it, but what you want to have something that's interesting aesthetically, or else people won't look at it very much anyway. But you want it to be accurate. Otherwise, why would you do it? You want to tell the truth about it. So you're sort of pulled both ways. It's a funny thing to do, I think. The ones that can capture, make it accurate as they can, but also aesthetically pleasing. Those are the ones that's what you're trying to do. But it's very hard because you have these restrictions that you might have to take a particular view or a particular height or something like that. So it's difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm just bringing it back to Marble Hill. How
Yeah.
do you approach the illustration of Marble Hill and the archaeology on site?
Well, I'm doing. I've done quite a lot of drawings of where the trenches are and the various features, like the ice house and the grotto, and where the bowling alley is. And I anticipate that I'm going to do. You showed a bit of the map of of the gardens. It's quite difficult to publish that map and to print it because it's very dense, isn't it, and dark. And I imagine doing a sort of plan of sort of half plan, maybe a bit more three-dimensional of that, with the features of the garden where we know where various things are placed, but making it much clearer. So that's what and then maybe having some larger versions like of the grotto. And I would very much like to do the inside of the grotto because I know they found the shells and things. I don't know if they had a hermit there. They had a hermit at Pope's Grotto, didn't they? I think. So that would be quite fun.
I don't know. I'm up though.
I think there was. I think there was. I don't think I've made that up.
No. I will open it up to the floor. I'm sure they're more knowledgeable than I am on these things.
Well, Pope's Grotto is not very far away.
No, absolutely not. And we do a lot of work with them. And
All
actually,
right.
we're
But
going
you
to.
haven't heard they had a hermit.
I didn't, but
Maybe I've just invented that.
no doubt someone will put us right on the chat, I'm fairly sure. So, or please do, please help. But you mentioned about the sort of length of time that sometimes, can take a while before you know what kind of illustrations you're being asked to present. Kind of what's the sort of time length that you normally have?
Well, it depends. I mean, if you imagine if you've got a big excavation that goes on over several seasons, several years. I mean, some of them would go on like for 20 years and everything. It obviously takes a long time to process all of that information. And think about the various specialists that are involved. Like, well, everything has a different. Like for the stuff from that came out of the pits, you have the pottery expert, you have the fines expert. You have the human bones expert. You have a whole lot of people all got to give their reports, all got to study everything. When I did the landscape with the ditching, I mean that was the archaeobotanist. So she's got to look at all of the soil samples to try and build up what sort of plants were growing there, so that we knew a sort of grassland that was there. So you think all of these things take a long time, and of course, it's not just one excavation. There's lots of other things they're having to do, lots of other reports they've got to write. So it can take really a long time. So by the time you might get, if it's a very small excavation, think like Brixton Deverill was a small excavation because they were just going in. They didn't want to excavate the site. They wanted to confirm the dating, I think. But then it was going to be left. So something like that wouldn't take too long. And then it wasn't really based on the excavation too much. It was based on the geophysics plan. So that was done fairly quickly. But some of those big excavations take years and years and years and years. In fact, that's always the complaint, really, that why is so and so not published? And the reason is that it's very, very complicated, really.
And when you're doing your pictures for Marble Hill, do you know where they will be placed?
No, I imagine they're going to be in the excavation report. But eventually, things go into the archives, and so are accessible to whoever wants to use them. And it's surprising how things crop up. I mean, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, there are all sorts of books, and I don't know, sometimes they're in newspapers, things like that.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to all of you who've asked questions. It's a delight to understand a little bit more about the whole process of how we go from a pit in the ground to some beautiful illustrations that you've produced. So thank you for sharing those with us.
Well, thank you.
A small plug, don't forget that there's the last in our archaeological lecture series in February with Thomas, and we have the Thames Luminaries for the next 3 weeks, sharing about all of our amazing historic locations around that are based around the Thames. So do check those out if you would like to be involved. And also our previous lectures are on our YouTube channel, so do look up the Marble Hill YouTube channel and you can find out more about the archaeological digs that have been happening. Thank you so much for your time, everybody, and thank you once again, Judith. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.